So let me give you an idea of how we'll be proceeding here. I want to first start with the fact that we really are in a new era of catastrophes, and I think all of you here in Rhode Island know that in terms of some of the things that we've been observing, and as Sunshine mentioned, this is now something that the Metcalf Institute is extremely concerned about, with climate change being on the agenda of everyone now, I think in a way that it hasn't been even here in the U.S. in the last few years. So I'll talk a little bit about that and highlight where climate change comes into the picture. And then what I want to focus on is a challenge in terms of a framework of how we link intuitive and deliberative thinking for dealing with the extreme events, focusing on concepts that some of you may have read in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where you really talk about the two modes of thinking and how we bring them together, and how do we move from intuitive to deliberative thinking, and then use that as a lead-in to the role that insurance, along with other policy tools, can play for dealing with this, and the challenges that one faces in dealing with protection prior to a disaster, where people often use intuitive thinking to deal with these issues, where it may cause one to think about how do we deal with the long term. And we tend to be very myopic and short run. I have lots of my own personal examples I could highlight for you in terms of my own behavior along these lines. I think we all have a challenge in thinking long term, but in terms of dealing with this, we have to really reflect on how to deal with that. And then I'll move from that to some of the issues that Sunshine mentioned in the context of the flood insurance program. How do we deal with the problems of flooding from hurricanes and from riverine flooding, but in flooding in general, to deal with reducing these losses in the future, and talk a little bit about a program that a few of us have been thinking about over the years in terms of how we can use both vouchers and insurance to deal with this. And then I'll end with some challenges and discussions and questions for discussion, and get hopefully some of your reactions and comments at the end. So that's kind of where I plan to go. Let me start just with a few ideas with respect to where we are in the way of catastrophes and how things have changed. This is just a little depiction, as you can see, in terms of the overall losses with respect to catastrophes from 1980 to 2012. I've just drawn a line here to highlight the fact this is an upward trend, both in the concept of insurance as well as in losses. And if you look at this data over here, which is the 25 most costly in catastrophes worldwide from 1970 to 2012, normalized in 2011 prices, we see that 16 of those occurred in the U.S., 18 of them, and that's the point to really reflect on, since 2001. And so we're really talking about things that have really changed in recent years, and there are lots of reasons for that with respect to that. Let me just highlight a few of these disasters around the world to give you an idea of sort of what has happened. Here in Japan, the Honshu earthquake with 10,000 fatalities, and the tsunami and the nuclear power plant, the trifecta, so to speak, with respect to 10,000 fatalities, $183 billion in damage. The Sichuan earthquake, 70,000 fatalities, 5 million homeless in China. I always like to put up this example of Hurricane Ivan, because it looks like the damage is really small relative to what you just saw. But if you look at 889 million, and then you look at essentially Grenada, which is where Ivan actually hit, that was 365% of its gross national product. So it had an enormous problem in terms of how it's going to recover. Hurricane Mitch in Honduras had a similar kind of problem. And so you're talking, as you look around the world, at a set of problems here that really are major for the developing countries, and obviously for all of us here in the U.S. And so Hurricane Sandy, with the famous picture that we're all aware of the roller coaster out in New Jersey that was underwater here, $65 billion in damage and 285 fatalities. I mention here Sandy because of the tremendous problems with infrastructure and the challenges that it's facing and is still facing today with respect to rebuilding and improving the infrastructure as a result of this. And this is the MTA, and there's been real challenges in how do you do a better job of making these safer, which is really what we're talking about here. How do we take some steps to improve our situation, reduce these losses, and how do we get kind of funds to be able to deal with that? So what's happening here? Why are we dealing with this problem? And this gets us into the issues of the development in the last few years. The key aspect of this is an enormous amount of development and urbanization in high hazard prone areas. A huge increase in the value at risk. And then on top of that, the theme of this meeting and the thing that has to come about is climate change and weather patterns that have been changing in recent years, as we're all aware. And so we have the climate change conditions. And with respect to hurricanes, are we coming back to a high hurricane cycle, independent of just the climate change? But then we have sea level rise and the problems with flood damage and more intense weather events coupled with the increased value at risk. It's going to cost us much, much more, and has cost us much, much more. So that's the issue that we're really talking about. We have people moving into these areas, and we have data that shows us that these things are going to be major problems. And Sunshine mentioned the New York City Climate Change Panel, and I'm not a climate scientist. Let me say that right away. I work with climate scientists. I'm interested in what they're doing. But from the vantage point of looking at what the climate scientists are saying, it's critical to understand what's likely to happen. And this is a book that came out right before Mayor Bloomberg was leaving office in June of 2013, a little less than a year ago now, that around this time actually, that illustrated essentially some of the climate risks and the challenges we face. And if we look at the data that comes out of that report by the climate scientists, with the uncertainty captured here, what's likely to happen with respect to sea level rise in New York City in this case, in the 2020s, not very long from now, and 2050s. And we can see essentially here that we have middle range estimates from 4 to 8 inches by 2020s, 11 to 24 inches, and it could be as high as 31 inches, 2.5 feet we're talking about here. And there are more optimistic ones on the other side, but the fact is this is going to be with us, and we have to deal with it. And everyone around in this room, I know, is aware of it. But when you see these figures and you see what could possibly happen, we really are faced with an enormous challenge in terms of how to deal with that. So this is some data that sort of highlights what we face. Take a look at Northern Europe and what would happen if the Greenland ice sheet was melting and who would be underwater. You would not necessarily want to spend a lot of time in London or in Rotterdam with the scenario that is painted over here in terms of what could actually happen. And this is a scenario, and we know scenarios are important in terms of how to deal with this. So what are our choices in terms of dealing with this? We have choices at various levels. We have choices at the country level, at the regional level, at the industry level, and at the individual level. And what we're hearing about a great deal today, as we're aware of in all the headlines and what President Obama has been doing just in the last week with EPA and using the Clean Air Act to try to reduce carbon emissions, that's something the country can do, that the region can do. Investment in energy efficiency are things that are clearly a way to deal with the climate change problem, and solar and wind are now becoming a more attractive set of options, and one can reflect on that. And then reducing losses from natural disasters, which is what I'll focus on today, that could be done at various levels in terms of addressing this. So there are a lot of possibilities in terms of how we can address these issues. We got to get people to do these things, and we have to sort of have policies in place to address them, and that's, I think, the big challenge we face in the world, and certainly in this country today and in other parts of the world. And having global meetings to try to deal with that. So, how do we actually address this problem in the context of a framework that I mentioned earlier, intuitive and deliberative thinking for extreme events? So if you put on your cap right now on how you make decisions and think about this in the context of a really great book that psychologist Daniel Kahneman wrote on thinking fast and slow, we can get an appreciation for these challenges. So let me look at these ideas, and Kahneman, in writing this book, was building on 30 to 50 years of research, primarily in psychology, to look at the thinking process and whatnot. And he talked about this from the vantage point of two systems. System 1 and System 2, intuitive thinking, which is parentheses System 1, and deliberative thinking, System 2. And he'd be the first one to sort of say there's a great deal of value in System 1 thinking. We make most of our decisions, or many of our decisions, on the basis of System 1, intuitive thinking, where we use simple associations, including emotional reactions to things. We highlight the importance of past experience, in fact, focus on our past experience, and we have a set of biases and simplified rules. So point number one on intuitive thinking is, for everyday decisions, where we have hundreds of decisions we make every day, this is a very, very good model to use. And one shouldn't forget the fact that we're often making these decisions, and we have to rely on our past experience. The problem comes in extreme events, in what we're talking about here, on low probability, high consequence events, where we have very little experience, and we're forced in somehow to say, how do we make decisions? And we tend to make them on the basis of intuitive thinking. And as a result, we make these decisions very poorly. And that is the challenge we face. We don't do them very well, and I'm going to illustrate that in a few minutes with respect to a set of examples. What we would like to try to do, particularly in this area, is to focus on more deliberative thinking. More thinking that look at the trade-offs between benefits and costs in taking steps. Should we protect our home? And how do we protect our home? What are the benefits of doing it? What are the costs? Not just next year, but over a long period of time, because the house is going to be around for a period of time. And so that's one aspect. Recognizing interconnectedness and interdependencies, things that we have a hard time doing. So if something happens in one area, it can have enormous impacts in others. Climate change, of course, is a classic example of that. Whatever happens in one country is not relegated to just that country. It is the entire world. And so we have a whole set of interconnectedness we should be thinking about. How do we coordinate our decisions? How do you get better decisions with a group of countries working together on these issues, communities working together, countries working together? And then, most important, focusing on long-term strategies. That is really the challenge. We are very, very myopic, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll highlight in a moment. We tend to think short-term, and yet these are problems that call for long-term strategies. And everyone says that. We all are it's easy said, but it's very, very hard to do. So that's what I want to focus on now, in terms of looking at the fact that there is intuitive thinking that takes place, but that we need to move towards deliberative thinking, and then suggest some ways we may want to try to do that. And I'll focus on the flood problem to highlight that point. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about behavior triggered by System 1, or intuitive thinking. And I want to make it intuitive thinking. And it's a blend, by the way, of intuition and deliberative thinking. You can't have one necessarily dominating. You all have to rely on the fact that we want to do things intuitively and should be doing things intuitively. But here's the problem. We have biases that are part of our decision-making process. A classic one that was developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky is an availability bias. And the bias is a very straightforward one. We estimate the probability of events and the likelihood of events by their salience. So before Hurricane Sandy, people would say, this isn't going to happen to me. It's not likely to happen to me. After Hurricane Sandy, it's going to happen to me. It's almost as if I'm going to take some steps now to do things, and then we forget a few years later and say it's not going to happen to me again. So we have this availability bias that dominates. Let me give you the classic example, because when we get into probability and we get into risk and uncertainty, we often try to sort of say, how should people behave? Well, the classic example of how people behave and say the right things but behave very differently is earthquakes. And when you ask people, essentially, are they going to purchase insurance or protect themselves against earthquakes before an earthquake occurs? No, don't have to do it, don't need it. Then after the earthquake, you'll find an enormous number of people buying insurance after their earthquake and taking protective actions, and you ask them the question, what's the likelihood of another earthquake occurring in your area? And almost unanimously, everyone says lower. It's much smaller. at which point you say, well, this is really interesting. Think a little bit about what you said. You said the probability is lower. You said you didn't need it beforehand. You said now you need it. What's going on with your decision processes? If you didn't buy it beforehand and you're telling us the probability is lower, you shouldn't, there's no reason for you to do it now. So there's something here that is happening. The same thing happens with flood insurance. The same thing happens with any protective measure. People will buy the insurance after the disaster, not before, unless they're required, and often they're not going to buy it even if they're required before. And then they will cancel their policy a few years later when they haven't had a loss. And that raises a whole set of issues as to what is going on. Well, other things are going on as part of it. Threshold models. Failure to take protective measures if the perceived likelihood of the disaster is below a threshold level of concern. So when you estimate the probability of being low, you say, I don't have to worry about it. It's not on my radar screen. I don't have to really pay attention. And when we have imperfect information and misperceive that, that exacerbates the problem, because if you think that the probability is 1 in 1,000 rather than perhaps what it actually is, 1 in 100, as the scientists might tell you, or 1 in 50, you're going to say, this probability is very low, I don't have to pay attention, and you don't even have the accurate information. And then most important, as I focused earlier, on top of all of this is our myopia, our focusing on short-term horizons. And the reason that that is so critical is that many of these decisions, particularly related to climate change, require upfront costs. You have to invest in making your house safer, whether it's elevating your house, whether it's flood protection, other ways of doing it. Communities have to invest in making communities safer. There are high upfront costs. If you focus on very, very short term, you'll never pass the benefit cost test. You're going to sort of say, look, I have all this money I'm putting in, I want my return back in 2 or 3 years. It'll never, ever work. It'll only work if you begin to say, well, what is this measure good for? It's good for the life of the house, or long-term community things, the kind of thing I heard about that was done with respect to here in Rhode Island, with respect to a gate that will protect oneself against storm surge for hurricanes, has a long-term benefit. You haven't had any yet, but it's there for a long-term sort of horizon. And that's the kind of things that one wants to do more of, but we have a very, very hard time. Businesses have a hard time, and so do consumers and homeowners. All of us have a hard time dealing with this. The bottom line is often, I don't want to incur these costs now, and particularly if it's not going to happen to me, and there are these threshold models, you're not going to do that. That's what we're faced with. It's these kinds of biases that we have to concern ourselves with as we go forward. So let me focus on a little example that I'll take us through in one way or another to show you how this plays out. So we've got the appropriate name, I think, the Lowland family residing in the Rockaways. They're considering whether to invest $1,500 in making their house safer, flood-proofing their house so it is less susceptible to water damage. Hydrologists have estimated the chances of storm surge from hurricanes affecting the home is a 1 in 100 chance, and it occurs, and if it does occur, the savings will be $27,500. So we've got 1 in 100, we've got $27,500. Now, let's talk about insurance for a moment, since that's an area that can actually highlight the benefits associated with taking these protective measures. If insurance premiums are reflecting risk, as they should, and you'll hear that from me in just a moment as one of the key principles here, then the insurance cost, just on a risk-based basis, the reduction in their premiums from taking this measure should be 1 in 100. That's the chance of the hurricane occurring and causing damage, times $27,500. That's the savings if they invest in these measures. $275 if they undertake this investment. That's what essentially the savings would be. Now, it's going to cost them $1,500, and you can see already where I'm going, and I'll show this in a little more specifically. It's a high cost relative to the annual benefits, but over 30 years, this is a very, very attractive investment, as we'll see when we take a look at the benefit cost analysis. So that's the problem that we're dealing with. Well, how's the Lowland family going to respond? First of all, they misperceive the risk. They don't have the data, so they say it's 1 in 1,000. So they don't realize that, and they don't have the insurance, and the insurance information isn't going to give them the data, because these premiums are often highly subsidized, and so they're not going to learn, they're not going to get that benefit. Threshold models, flood risk is below my level of concern. Myopic behavior, I'm not going to consider the long-term benefits of flood protection. And then, as I said earlier, canceling insurance, they consider to be a poor investment several years later since they haven't suffered any flood-related damage. So they got everything working against doing these things. And we have on top of that financial institutions, the banks and financial institutions, and they don't enforce the insurance requirement. So they don't, and I'll show, we'll look at some data in just a moment, because flood insurance is required in high hazard areas if you have a federally insured mortgage, and most of the banks don't actually require that. The other aspect, which is very important to consider as a part of this, is that there are measures that complement insurance, building codes being critical in this domain, because you want to make these buildings safer, and a code is supposed to do that. Well, Florida is a classic example of this kind of behavior prior and before Hurricane Andrew. Before Hurricane Andrew, Florida is probably the worst state in the country with respect to enforcing its building codes. One of the worst. I won't say the worst, but it was very poor. 1/3 of the damage could have been avoided in 1992 because Florida had enforced its codes. What's interesting is it took Hurricane Andrew, but Hurricane Andrew did it. Florida has one of the best building codes today with respect to enforcing it because they learned from Hurricane Andrew what it meant not to do it. So there is a learning process, and that's important. We do learn from these disasters. Can we learn from Hurricane Sandy? That's a real question that's on the table right now, and be interested in getting your reactions to that as a part of this dialogue. So here's some better data, or some data with respect to the flood insurance example that I mentioned earlier, because of people canceling. Here is some data from a study by Tobin and Calfee in 2005 in Vermont, where they found out that 84% of the residents in special flood hazard areas, SFHA is a special flood hazard area, did not have flood insurance. 45% of those people were required to purchase it. So that's one example. But our risk center has the entire database with respect to the National Flood Insurance Program. So we've been analyzing it, and this research, by the way, that I'm talking about today is due to lots of other people. Erwin Michel Kirjan and a number of other people in our risk center have been involved in this, and we've been working with a number of other schools and organizations on this. So you should know that this is really a broad-based kind of research agenda, and what I'm talking about is coming out of that kind of dialogue. Well, here's just some examples of people who bought a flood insurance policy in 2001, and 1 year later only 73% had this, and you look down 3 years, only 39%, and you can see where this has gone. Now, it is true that some of these people moved away, but not that many. And when you look at essentially how many people are actually canceling their policies throughout this period, we see this is a major problem, and I'm going to come back to that in terms of some proposals we may actually want to deal with. So how do we get, we talk about intuitive thinking, but the answer that has to be, are there ways to encourage deliberative thinking? Are there ways to get people to actually pay attention? Well, this is the biggest challenge, and we have never been able to get a good answer, even from the insurance industry, in how to deal with this. How do you convince people by giving them better information on the role of insurance? And how do we convince all of you and lots of other people the best return on an insurance policy is no return at all? Celebrate the fact you haven't had a loss, and your premium is supposed to help you if you do have a loss. That is the hardest point to get across, and so there are challenges in doing that. So what we would say is, use the availability bias to focus on the consequences. Let's not focus on the low probability. Give scenarios and tell people, look, here are the financial problems if you do have a disaster and you're uninsured or you're not protecting yourself. What is going to happen to you? And create those scenarios, the vivid scenarios, without necessarily having a person go through a disaster, so that they will see that there are some benefits. And then the one that we have done with a series of experiments, and lots of people have done these things, but we've been involved in this as well, is stretch the time horizon. So here's a simple example. 1 in 100 chance that the Lowland family is going to have a disaster next year. So say to the Lowland family and everyone else, look, if you're living in your house for 25 years, there's a greater than 1 in 5 chance of experiencing at least one flood during that period. That's scenario. Those two probabilities are identical. All we've done is stretch the time horizon. If we treat them as independent events, if we have climate change and a lot of other things on top of it, the probability is going to be greater than 1 in 5. This is a conservative estimate, not a realistic estimate, but even that, at 1 in 100 each year, independent year after year, this is the same. We've done experiments with students and with a lot of other people. We give half the class the scenario of 1 in 100 and ask them how much they're going to pay for insurance. We give the other half, we say next year you have to pay for insurance for the following year, but we give you the scenario of 1 in 5. You get 4 to 5 times as much that people are willing to pay and a much greater interest in insurance. They are the same bits of information, but somehow that 1 in 5 people will pay attention. So it's in that direction at least that one may want to think. Okay, so I think we got the picture here, I hope, that we need to do something about this issue, and insurance is one way to deal with this. So what I'm going to do for the remaining portion of the talk is to talk a bit about the role of insurance, but to try to embed this in the challenges we face today with the National Flood Insurance Program as an example of how do we address this issue and an opportunity for really doing a better job than we currently are doing. So let's talk a little bit about guiding principles of insurance. You've already heard me say this, but I want to say it very explicitly. Principle number 1, and this is a principle that we talked about in a book that we did a few years back called At War with the Weather, where we looked at the hurricane problem in some detail. We're looking at Florida, New York, Texas, and South Carolina. And we highlight that in the book that Sunshine mentioned on insurance and behavioral economics. Insurance premiums should and must reflect risk. They must reflect risk. If they're going to play the role, they should. Why is that? 2 principal reasons. One is it tells people how hazardous the area is. If you get a highly subsidized premium, you think you're safe because the premium is so low. If you get a premium that is high, you know you're in trouble. Now you need good maps, and we can talk about that at the end. You need the FEMA to have a better mapping program, and that is critical as part of that. But you do need to have that as a signal as to the hazard. But the other reason is just as important. It encourages people to invest in adaptation or mitigation measures to reduce their losses because they'll get a premium discount and they'll get something back. And so as a result of that, they know that they're benefiting. And I remember talking with a colleague of mine or a friend of mine, Shirley Lasko, who is in New Orleans and is suffering losses from Katrina or suffering from Katrina. And she said she made her house really safer and never got a penny back, and always resented the fact that she never got any money back for making her house safer, and she knew she should have gotten money back, but the premiums were highly subsidized either because the regulators controlled the premiums or the flood insurance premiums were highly subsidized, and there was nothing to give back. So that's principle number 1. But before we continue, you know, and I know, and everyone knows, you're dead if that's the only principle. There's no way politically you're ever going to get this through, and we'll talk about bigger waters, and we'll talk about changes in a few minutes in the flood program. So principle number 2 is absolutely central to complement principle number 1, and that's dealing with equity and affordability. And we're saying here, lower income people, people who need help for whatever reason, special treatment, have to be assisted if the premiums go way up. And all of you realize that from bigger waters, when that was passed, premiums were going to go way up in many of these areas. You've got to develop some system for dealing with the affordability issue, but don't do it through an insurance premium. Do it through other ways, and we're suggesting vouchers to individuals that require special treatment. And the point that I'm going to make here, and you can react to this, is you only give people a voucher if they're capable of mitigating their properties to reduce future flood losses. So it's a carrot and a stick. You sort of say, look, you're going to get help, and we'll talk about that with an example in a moment in terms of how that would work, but you have to do something to reduce your losses, and we'll help you financially to do that. Now, there are going to be people who can't do anything, and there's a whole set of challenges on what you do. Get them to move from an area, assist them in some ways. That is a real problem, and I'll focus on the ones who can mitigate, but most people can do things to reduce their damages, and the question is, how do you do it? And then principle number 3, and this relates directly to climate change, move away from annual insurance contracts. Have multi-year insurance contracts for a lot of reasons. First, premiums should reflect risk with respect to dealing with affordability. It addresses myopia, and it encourages investment in loss reduction measures because you know you have insurance over a period of time. We're not necessarily talking 20 years, talk about 5 years and reduce those and recheck the premiums after 5 years with climate change and other features. But move away from the annual contracts and move them and get them so that they are tied to the property and not the individual. So you don't have the whole issue of people canceling their policy. So those are the 3 principles. So there are voucher programs that exist. The food stamp program we're all very aware of. There are low-income energy assistance programs, universal service ones, lots of programs that actually exist for dealing with this. So this isn't out of the blue, the idea of vouchers. These are things we currently do. HUD has a set of programs, the Housing and Urban Development, for dealing with vouchers. So they are feasibility, and just for full disclosure, I'm on a National Research Council committee on affordability and flood insurance, and we are in the process of trying to figure out ways to deal with that issue. So if any of you have ideas, please feel free to transmit them, and we'll try to get that out as things that we can think about. Anyway, that's a direction. All right, let's go through a couple of these examples and as to how this plays out. Now we've got the Lowland family. The Lowland family, we already know what their losses are, what the potential losses are, what their expected annual benefits, and we're going to look over time now. We're going to look at a 10% discount rate, which is a high discount rate, by the way, and as a result, being very conservative, lower discount rates are going to make that protected measure even more attractive. But with 10%, we basically ask ourselves, well, how is this going to play out? Well, this is how it plays out for the Lowland family. If they're myopic, as we often are, they're not going to want to incur the upfront cost of adaptation because the cost is $1,500, and you can see with the discounting, here's the benefits over time. It'll take you 8 years or more to recover your investment, but for a 30-year house or 30-year mortgage or 20-year mortgage, this is an attractive option. So we have to deal with the myopia problem. How do we deal with it? Well, here's a way to deal with it. Instead of forcing the Lowland family to incur the upfront cost of $1,500, give them a 20-year loan tied to the mortgage. Their annual interest rate at 10% is $145. It would be even lower if the interest rate was 3% or 4%, which is closer to something we can get today. The reduction in their premium, their payment is $275. As a result of this, they are saving $130 each year. So financially, if they're willing to do this, this is a no-brainer financially. They are basically paying less for the loan than they are getting back in the insurance premium reduction. So the idea is stretching the time horizon by having loans and other measures can deal with this problem. Okay, how do we deal with this in the context of the current flood insurance program? Well, what we would say, as I said a moment ago, is we want to encourage investment in loss reduction measures. So we want risk-based premiums, home improvement loans, premium reductions for undertaking those measures. Affordability, means-tested vouchers, covers the insurance premiums and mitigation loans. Condition for a voucher, you got to mitigate, that's the deal, carrot and stick. Required flood insurance and loans tied to the property, not the home. So let me show you how work that Carolyn Kuski from Resources for the Future and I have done. There's a paper here, and I think we can post that paper on the website with respect to something that just came out in the New Journal, Extreme Events, on how we would try to analyze this for a county in New Jersey that suffered enormous amounts of damage from Hurricane Sandy, Ocean County, and has a lot of low-income people. So this is Ocean County, New Jersey, $580,000. Two families to highlight essentially how this plays out. And these are families in 2 flood zones. Family 1 is in the A zone. They pay $4,000 for flood insurance based on the premium that reflects risk. Family 2 is in a more hazardous zone, the V zone, and their premium has gone up to $18,550 for flood insurance. We are assuming, just for these examples, both homes are 3 feet below base flood elevation, so they're like the Lowland family, low. Each family has an annual income of $50,000, and these are data that effectively talk about the cost of elevating their homes. $25,000 for family 1 and $55,000 for family 2. So, and these are data that we have gotten from various sources to illustrate essentially how this would play out. So if we give them a 3% loan, which is what you could get for 20 years, the annual payment for family 1 is $1,680, and for family 2 is $3,660. Now, how do needs-tested vouchers come into play? What we're assuming here is that we're not going to require any of these families to pay for the insurance and mitigation costs if it turns out that it's more than 5% of their income, which is a figure that has been used as a basis for this kind of measure. So in this case, for these $50,000 income earners, it would be $2,500. Anything over $2,500 gets paid by the voucher, and you require them to mitigate. Here are examples of family 1 and family 2. If you only had the insurance voucher alone, no mitigation, you can see the cost to the federal government would be extraordinarily high, particularly for the V-zone property. The blue shows the cost to the federal government. Here's the cost to the homeowner. They're not going to pay anything more than the $2,500 that we showed. For the A-zone property, if you get them to mitigate and give them a loan, they are not going to have, there won't be any cost to the federal government at all. And with an insurance voucher, there'd have to be something, and it goes way, way down after 20 years. So right away, what we have is we have a way to attract the Tea Party, the conservatives, and others who are thinking this is the direction to go. We're helping out the notion of where the federal government plays a role by reducing the risk, but we're also helping on the affordability side. And if you then look at how this plays out for the entire county, these are the costs essentially to Promotion City for the voucher and for the mitigation loan, and considerably lower. Anyway, that's a direction, a way that we would see addressing it to bring intuitive thinking, because you're stretching the time horizon by the loan and by the notion of getting it tied to the property to deal with these issues. So let me just say here, everyone is a winner. My favorite icon here, we're all winners here, in theory. Lower payments for the homeowner, reduction in flood losses for the National Flood Insurance Program, financial institutions a more secure investment due to lower losses from the disaster, the federal government a lower voucher cost due to the reduced insurance premiums because the property is mitigated, and for all of us, all around the country, less disaster assistance. So that's the direction that we want to go. What are the challenges we face? I want to take the last few minutes here to highlight that and maybe then get your comments, I hope you do, in terms of some of the challenges that you see. First, bigger waters. We worked, a number of us, and I'll say our risk center, worked for 5 years to try to get this piece of legislation in place. It really is the most important piece of legislation in our view for dealing with the flood program. They had risk premiums for second homes and those with repetitive flooding. They actually had a study, which unfortunately got delayed for 18 months, and that's one of the reasons this legislation got changed, as we know, and you'll see in a moment. And so they did all the right things in stressing these things, and they did it with a national program, so there's a real chance of doing something. This was passed 3 months before Hurricane Sandy. There's not a prayer that this would have been passed after Hurricane Sandy because of all the problems we see, and we know it has been repealed in a fashion, and that's basically what happened in March. And the reason it has been repealed, the principal reason that it was repealed, is due to NIMTOF behavior. Anyone know the acronym NIMTOF? NIMTOF behavior. Not in my term of office. Everyone is faced with an election in November 2014. The Senate had people there, not only from New Jersey, but from Louisiana and Mississippi. They whipped the whole Senate and House together to repeal this piece of legislation because they were afraid as to what would happen if they had the orders in place. And what was passed by 400 and some odd House members in July 2012, bigger orders, was also passed by that number, and even a larger number in March of this year. And so they recognize the concerns, and I wouldn't in any way suggest that they shouldn't. This may have been very rational on their part. It offers an opportunity to do something today. So we see this as positive, negative and positive. The fact that it was repealed highlights how important affordability is, and the challenge is, how do we deal with this today? So, the challenge: how do we develop long-term strategies for dealing with climate change and sea level rise and deliberative thinking? How do we have short-term incentives for encouraging this behavior? And how do we develop a risk management strategy, perhaps along the lines of what I'm thinking, but you may have a number of other ideas and questions for dealing with this. I want to end with just a few points on how this all played out in the broader issue of which Sunshine mentioned some of this introduction. I was a coordinating author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the chapter on risk and uncertainty. And there is a chapter available for any of you who are interested. We had a wonderful group of lead authors, and really, I think the chapter itself really highlights a lot of these points. We had psychologists there, we had decision analysts there. It was a very, very mixed group, and I think at the end we came out with a chapter that highlights the impact of risk and uncertainty on policy choices, how risk perception plays a role, how we need tools and decision aids to analyze risk and uncertainty, and most important, we need managing uncertainty through robust policy strategies and instruments. So that's a framework with respect to that. Second point I want to make is that the National Climate Change policy document that we know, the National Climate Change Assessment Report, is absolutely central to where we're going in this country. And I was involved in one of the chapters, but didn't play a major role with respect to that. But except I followed it. But the people who really were at the head of that particular assessment have orchestrated the public policy dialogue, and we hear about this every day in some fashion. And of course, we can see what's going to happen here. This is one of the things that came out of that. Flooding from climate change could cost the U.S. $325 billion a year by 2100. So we have a major problem. Last points. Future research to encourage investment in loss reduction measures. I've talked about all these already. Make it more salient, stretch the time horizon, highlight the expected benefits, tie loans to the property, examine the role of multi-year insurance, look at new technology and how they can deal with this. And the long-term issues, how long, critically important, how long will it take FEMA to develop new maps that more accurately assess the risk? Absolutely have to have those maps. How costly will the programs be to the federal government and residents in flood-prone areas? Short-term challenges: how can we restore the best features of bigger waters? How can the impacts of climate change be incorporated in designing flood insurance to encourage investment in adaptation measures? And finally, what are the most appropriate ways of dealing with affordability issue? What data needs to be collected, and what experiments and surveys should be undertaken? So those are some of the things that we have to think about. Conclusions: insurance markets can help spread the risk of unavoidable disasters and offer incentives to mitigate the risk, but they can't work miracles, especially in low probability, high consequence events. We need a whole suite of policies to deal with that. Climate change, with its impact on sea level rise, raises a set of challenging questions with respect to implementing mitigation and adaptation measures, and we need to encourage deliberative thinking by focusing on the long term while providing short-term incentives for acting now rather than waiting by assuming it will not happen to me, which is what I need to do, all of us. So, a couple of little cartoons to end this. This is one way to deal with the flood insurance program. It's not the ideal way, but Jerry looked at the flood insurance and said it's too goddamn expensive. So this is, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but this is a way. And here's a climate change one. It's settled. We agreed to sign a pledge to hold another meeting, consider changing course at a date yet to be determined. Our iceberg effect. There's a book that the National Research Council was involved in on disaster resilience that highlights a number of challenges for us, communities, the nation, and then I'll just end with a little a note on the book that we had written on insurance and behavioral economics, which I hope some of you may be interested in, and how do we sort of deal with principles of insurance. So on that note, let me thank you all for your attention.